Recent charges against Vice Admiral Mark Norman being stayed, of course, by the Crown, potentially sparing the Liberal government of an embarrassing trial. But given that this is now in a set of circumstances within SNC-Lavalin, how tarnished is that Liberal Party brand?
Pretty severely. It's not just the party brand, it's also the leaders' personal approval ratings have been sinking now for the better part of 2 years, since really early 2017. And there's been a number of contributing factors, whether from broken promises on the deficit or on electoral reform, to of course the India trip last year, which really did him some damage. But SNC-Lavalin particularly seems to have caused a further cratering of their support. They were not so long ago in the mid to high 40s in the polls. They're now below 30. They are 7 points on average behind the Conservatives before they used to have a very comfortable lead. So it's been a pretty serious erosion. Whether it's permanent or not, of course, no one knows. But if there had been a trial of Vice Admiral Norman, if there had been confirmation of what the defense had been saying, that there had been political interference in that case as well, that would have really caused, I think, really fatal damage to them. I think that would really cause a lot of people to say this is just out of control. As it is, there's a whiff around this, there's a stench around this. I think he was very badly treated, but I don't think it'll be quite as catastrophic for them as if the defense theories had been confirmed. But it's another bash against them to some extent, and it does mean they've got a very hard situation ahead of them in the next 5-6 months to try and turn this around.
You mentioned the leader of the Liberal Party, our Prime Minister, who campaigned so well in 2015. So I'm wondering, is he as much the problem as he is the solution?
I think he's become very much the problem, and because he was the solution. They had invested so much in him, and as you say, in 2015 it paid off. He was underestimated. People didn't think he could do it. He campaigned well. I think he caused a lot of people who had been sort of wishing him well but weren't sure about him. I think in the course of that campaign had a close look at them and said, okay, I think he's ready. So he came into power with very high public approval ratings. He had campaigned, as you know, on a different way of doing politics, a more idealistic approach to public policy, an end to the kind of cynicism and meanness of the Harper years. And with those kinds of expectations, I suppose what you could say there's nowhere to go but down. But they invested so heavily in him, as I say. They put him on every magazine cover and every viral video to an extent I've never seen. I mean, politics in Canada is always excessively leader-focused, but this was on a level that you really hadn't seen before. And the danger, of course, in that is that people can fall out of love as quickly as they fall into it. And I think that's what's happened, is not without cause, because I think he's revealed himself to be a much more conventional, calculating, cynical power politician than perhaps people had appreciated in 2015.
The Liberals, I guess, recently announcing that Trans Mountain could be a go-ahead, introducing greater incentives to the child tax benefit. So I'm just wondering whether or not they can ride that or introduce some initiatives that could help them ride this wave and potentially to re-election in October.
I don't think those on their own would be enough. The problem in politics is once people kind of bake in an impression of you, or particularly of your leader, because what tends to happen is people make up their mind about the leader first, and then that bleeds into their decision about what they think about the party. It doesn't mean that everything is set in stone. People can change their minds. But each of these things has both a permanent and a transitory effect. So SNC-Lavalin, for example, has had a very deep impact on their popularity in the short term, some of which will recede over time as people forget about it, but some of it will stay. Turning that around is very difficult. That's the first point. The second point is, to the extent you can turn things around on policy, it's typically more where you have some really big initiative that you own one side of. So the classic example would be the first Mulroney government in the 1980s, who went through an even worse swoon in popularity than the Trudeau Liberals have done. They started off above 50% and they were down to 20-something. But they had the free trade initiative, and they were the only party on the pro-free trade side. So they owned that share of the vote. Everybody else had to split the vote. The problem for the Liberals is anything that they would be likely to bring forward, they'll be sharing that vote with the Greens, the NDP, and even the Bloc Québécois. Whereas the Tories are, again, pretty much alone. That can be a weakness for the Tories, but sometimes that can be a strength for them. And that's the danger the Liberals have, is that it's hard to think of some big initiative they could come up with in the next few months that they would look credible on, A, and B, that the other parties wouldn't, on the left, wouldn't also be sharing in their support. And this is the big dilemma for the Liberals, is they've invested so heavily in the environment, and lo and behold, the Greens are the party that seem to be benefiting.
Let's talk about the Tories, and I'm wondering whether or not Opposition Leader Andrew Scheer could be capitalizing more on this moment.
Well, he's an interesting puzzle. So I talked about how Trudeau's support has gone down. It's not been because there's been any wave of enthusiasm for Andrew Scheer. I think he's comes across as sort of a very cautious, calculating politician, very milquetoast in his demeanor. But sometimes that can wear well with people. People got very excited about Trudeau, but maybe are a little less excited about charisma and that sort of thing at this stage, and maybe want something a little blander. These things go in waves.
Or stable.
Or that's right. I mean, you can turn these things into virtues. What he is doing now, and I think he's right to do, is going out and giving a series of big speeches where he kind of lays out, not necessarily in very granular terms, but there's been some nuggets already in his first speech on foreign policy, but he's going to lay out a series of speeches on broad public policy areas. The intent, I think, being to give people a sense of who he is, what he stands for, what his priorities and his values are. I think that's a very good move on his part. I think he also has to address this issue that the Liberals are certainly pushing very hard on, which is he in any way dog whistling to, pandering to, sympathetic to people on the anti-immigrant right? He will say very stoutly he does not, but I think he needs more work to do, because there have been occasions when he has taken stands in areas around that. For example, raising this question of a global migration compact, which is this anodyne UN document, as somehow a threat to Canadian sovereignty. He needs to do work, I think, to reassure people. And if I can just put that in calculating terms, if he was worried about the Max Bernier's People's Party as stealing votes in his right, that seems to have receded somewhat. And meanwhile, with the implosion of the Liberals, maybe implosion is too strong a word, but with the decline of the Liberals, I think there's a lot of centrist voters who would be willing to give the Tories a look if they could reassure them on these kinds of issues.